Sasha moved through the terminal like any other traveler. Headphones in, rolling suitcase behind her, eyes fixed on the gate number glowing overhead. She wore a soft gray hoodie, jeans that had seen better days, and sneakers scuffed just enough to prove they'd walked real miles. No entourage, no sunglasses hiding her face. Just a young woman with a boarding pass and a 2-hour layover in a sprawling airport that smelled faintly of coffee, disinfectant, and jet fuel. It was one of those in-between moments that life is mostly made of, neither dramatic nor dull, just ordinary. She'd been visiting a friend in Chicago and was now heading back east for a family dinner. Her parents were meeting her at the final destination. She hadn't told many people she was traveling alone. She liked it that way. After years of living under the world's gaze, anonymity felt like a gift, even if it only lasted for a few hours. She found a seat near gate B14, tucked between a mom trying to calm a fussy toddler and a businessman scrolling through emails with tired eyes. She plugged in her earbuds, queued up a playlist of old soul tracks her dad used to play on Sunday mornings, and let the music wrap around her like a familiar blanket. For a while, everything was fine. Then the group arrived. They came in loud. 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in matching golf shirts with a corporate logo stitched on the chest. They laughed too hard at their own jokes, spoke over each other, and claimed a cluster of seats like they owned the place. One of them dropped a carry-on with a thud that made the toddler jump. The mother shot them a look, but they didn't notice or didn't care. At first, they paid Sasha no mind. But then one of the women glanced her way, nudged her friend, and said something under her breath. A chuckle rippled through the group. Sasha kept her eyes on her phone, pretending not to hear, but the comments didn't stop. "Look at her," one of the men said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "Thinks she's somebody. Probably waiting for her private jet," another added with a smirk. "Or her bodyguard." They weren't shouting. They didn't have to. Their tone was casual, almost playful, but laced with something sharper. The kind of teasing that feels like a shove disguised as a joke. Sasha's fingers tightened around her phone. She knew this game. She'd seen it before. People assuming things about her based on how she carried herself, the way she dressed, even the quiet confidence in her posture. It wasn't the first time strangers had mistaken her composure for arrogance. She considered moving. But why should she? She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just sitting there, minding her own business. And deep down, a stubborn part of her refused to let them win by making her disappear. A few rows away, an older man in a worn leather jacket watched the scene unfold. He recognized her instantly, not because he was a political junkie, but because he'd seen her grow up on TV and photos, in rare public appearances. He remembered her as a little girl holding her father's hand on the White House lawn, and now here she was, a young woman just trying to get home. He frowned, glancing toward the group. He wanted to say something, but he wasn't sure what good it would do. Sometimes speaking up only made things worse. Back at the group's seats, the comments grew bolder. "Bet she's never worked a real day in her life," one of the men said, stretching his legs into the aisle. "Probably got someone else paying for that designer bag," another chimed in. Though Sasha's tote was from a small black-owned brand she'd discovered online, not a luxury label, she didn't react. Not outwardly. But inside, a familiar mix of frustration and weariness settled in. She'd spent her teenage years learning how to navigate this, how to hold her head high when people whispered behind her back, how to smile politely when someone made a passive-aggressive remark about her last name. She'd been taught that dignity was its own kind of armor, but armor gets heavy. Nearby, a college student waiting for the same flight pulled out her phone and started recording, not to post, but just in case things escalated. She didn't know who Sasha was, but she could tell something was off. The way the group kept glancing over, the smirks, the low laughter, it felt targeted, unkind. The student hesitated, thumb hovering over the record button. Should she step in? Would anyone back her up? The tension in the air thickened. Even the toddler seemed to sense it, quieting down and clinging to his mother's leg. The businessman stopped typing and glanced up, his expression unreadable. Sasha finally looked up from her phone, not with anger, but with a calm, steady gaze that caught the group off guard. For a second, they faltered. Then one of them laughed nervously and said, "What?" "Can't take a joke." She didn't answer. She just turned her music up a little louder and stared straight ahead. But her jaw was tight. Her shoulders, usually relaxed, were rigid, Unseen by everyone, a text buzzed on a phone in the security office near the gate. It was from a retired Secret Service agent now working private detail, someone who'd once guarded the Obama family and still kept an eye out. He'd been tipped off by a friend in the terminal who'd spotted Sasha and noticed the commotion. The message was brief. "She's at B14. Some folks giving her trouble." The agent didn't call the police. He didn't alert airport security in a formal way. Instead, he sent a quiet message to another number, one that rarely received texts unless it was urgent. 20 minutes earlier, Barack Obama had landed at the same airport, arriving from a speaking engagement on the West Coast. He was scheduled to meet Sasha at their final destination, but his flight had been moved up. He'd just cleared baggage claim when his phone lit up. He read the message, paused, and immediately changed direction. He didn't rush. He never did. But there was a new purpose in his stride as he headed toward Terminal B. Back at the gate, the group had quieted, for now. They'd gotten bored of their own game. Or maybe Sasha's silence had unnerved them more than they expected. They turned their attention to snacks and flight updates, but the air still felt charged, like the calm before a storm no one could name. Sasha checked the departure board. Still 40 minutes until boarding. She exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the unease. She thought about calling her mom, but decided against it. She didn't want to worry her. Besides, it was over now, right? Then she saw him, not right away. First, it was just a shift in the crowd, a ripple of double takes, hushed whispers, phones lifting discreetly. People straightened in their seats. A flight attendant paused mid-stride. The college student lowered her phone, eyes wide. And then there he was. Barack Obama walked into the gate area like he belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. He wore a dark jacket, no tie, hands in his pockets. His expression was calm, but his eyes scanned the space with quiet intensity. When they landed on Sasha, his face softened for just a second, relief, concern, love all flickering beneath the surface. He didn't head straight for her. Instead, he moved toward the group that had been mocking her. They hadn't noticed him yet, too busy arguing over who got the window seat. He stopped a few feet away. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but clear. All 5 of them turned. Recognition hit like a wave. One of the women gasped. Another man actually stood up so fast he knocked over his soda. The can rolled across the floor, spilling sticky liquid near Sasha's shoes. For a long moment, no one spoke. The entire gate area seemed to hold its breath. Then Obama said, gently but firmly, "I couldn't help but overhear what you were saying about my daughter." The words landed like stones in still water. Sasha didn't move. She just watched, heart pounding, as the color drained from their faces. The man who'd joked about the private jet opened his mouth, then closed it. The woman who'd nudged her friend looked like she wanted to vanish into the carpet. We didn't know," one of them stammered. Obama nodded slowly. "I know. That's what worries me." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to shrink the space, to make their earlier bravado seem small and foolish. "I get it," he continued. "People make assumptions, we all do. But when those assumptions turn into cruelty, even if it's just a joke, it says more about you than it does about the person you're talking about." He glanced back at Sasha, who gave him the tiniest nod. Then he turned his attention fully to the group. "My daughter has every right to sit here in peace just like anyone else. She doesn't owe you an explanation for how she dresses, how she carries herself, or who she is. None of us do." One of the women started to cry, not dramatically, just quiet tears of shame. "We're so sorry," she whispered. Obama studied them for a long moment. Then, with a sigh that sounded more tired than angry, he said, "Just remember this the next time you see someone alone in an airport, or anywhere. You never know who they are. And more importantly, you never know what they've been through." He turned and walked over to Sasha. She stood up, and for a brief second they just looked at each other, father and daughter. "Private in a very public moment, you okay?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay." He picked up her tote bag, slung his own duffel over his shoulder, and gestured toward the boarding line that was just starting to form. "Let's go home." As they walked away, the gate area remained silent. No one clapped. No one cheered. But something had shifted. The college student deleted the video she'd recorded. The older man in the leather jacket smiled to himself. Even the toddler seemed to relax. And the group that had caused the trouble? They boarded their flight without a word, heads down, already rehearsing how they'd explain this to their families, if they ever did. But none of that mattered to Sasha now. She walked beside her father, the noise of the airport fading into the background. For the first time in hours, she felt seen, not as a symbol, not as a target, but simply as herself, and that was enough. The moment Barack Obama stepped away from the group and walked toward his daughter, the air in the terminal changed. It wasn't just that people recognized him, though many did, their eyes widening, their steps slowing. It was the quiet authority he carried, the kind that didn't need volume or flash to be felt. He moved like someone used to walking into rooms where history had already been made, yet he treated this ordinary airport gate like it mattered just as much. Sasha stayed close as they joined the slow-moving line forming near the jet bridge. She kept her eyes down at first, not out of shame, but because she was still untangling the knot in her chest. The mocking words had stung, yes, but what lingered was the loneliness of it. The feeling of being singled out in a crowd, of having to decide whether to speak up or stay silent, knowing either choice came with a cost. Now, with her father beside her, that weight began to lift. Not because he'd rescued her, but because he'd simply shown up. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly, adjusting the strap of her tote. "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." They didn't say much after that. There was no dramatic lecture, no grand speech about dignity or public image, just two people walking side by side, reconnected by something deeper than words. A flight attendant greeted Obama with a respectful nod but didn't make a fuss. A teenager a few feet away snapped a quick photo with his phone, then immediately put it away, as if sensing this wasn't a moment for social media. Inside the plane, they found their seats, window and aisle, middle left empty. Sasha slid in first, pressing her forehead briefly against the cool glass. Outside, baggage handlers moved with practiced efficiency, and a ground crew member gave a thumbs up to the cockpit. Normal things. Reassuring things. As the cabin doors closed and the safety demonstration played overhead, Obama leaned slightly toward his daughter. "You sure you're okay?" She nodded, offering a small smile. "Yeah, it just caught me off guard. I thought I was past all that." "You never really are," he said gently. "Not completely, but you learn how to carry it." She knew what he meant. Growing up in the public eye meant learning early that your presence could be interpreted as a statement, even when you were just trying to buy coffee or wait for a flight. People projected their hopes, fears, and biases onto you without ever asking who you really were. Over time, you built walls, not to shut people out, but to protect the quiet parts of yourself that needed space to breathe. The plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky. Below, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Above, the clouds glowed pink in the late afternoon sun. Back at the gate they'd just left, the ripple of what had happened was still spreading. Quietly, carefully. A woman who'd been waiting for a different flight called her sister as soon as she got to her car. "You'll never believe who I saw," she said, voice hushed with awe. "And what happened?" She described the scene without exaggeration, focusing not on the former president's entrance but on the way he'd spoken. Calm, firm, human. It wasn't about power, she told her sister. It was about respect. At a nearby coffee shop inside the terminal, the college student who'd almost recorded the incident sat with her notebook open, pen hovering. She wasn't writing for a class or a blog. She was trying to capture the feeling, the shift in energy when someone chooses kindness over spectacle, when accountability arrives not with shouting, but with presence. She'd grown up hearing about the Obamas in history books, but today, she'd seen something textbooks couldn't convey. How leadership could feel personal, even intimate. Meanwhile, the group that had mocked Sasha sat in stunned silence on their own flight, which had boarded shortly after. They hadn't spoken to each other since leaving the gate. One man kept replaying Obama's words in his head. "It says more about you than it does about her." He'd meant it as a joke, harmless, he thought, but now it felt like a mirror. Had he really been that careless? That unkind? He stared out the window, wondering if he'd ever be able to explain this to his kids without sounding like a fool. Word hadn't gone viral, not yet. No headlines, no trending hashtags, but in the way stories often do in real life, It traveled through whispers, texts, and quiet conversations between strangers who'd witnessed something worth remembering. At the airport's operations center, a supervisor reviewed security footage, not because of a complaint but out of curiosity. He watched the clip 3 times. The first time he focused on Obama's approach, the second on Sasha's stillness, the third on the faces of the group as realization hit. He didn't save the footage or share it. He just closed the file and made a note in the log. Minor disturbance resolved without incident, but it wasn't minor to those who'd been there. Later that evening, a retired schoolteacher who'd been waiting for her granddaughter's flight sat at her kitchen table sipping tea. She'd recognized Sasha right away, not from politics but from an old magazine photo she'd kept on her fridge years ago, back when the girl was in middle school. "She looks so tired today," the teacher murmured to her cat, like she just wanted to be left alone. She thought about writing a letter, just a short note to let Sasha know someone saw her, someone understood, but she didn't know where to send it. So instead she tucked the thought away, a small act of silent solidarity. Back on the plane, the cabin lights dimmed. Passengers settled in for the flight. A baby slept in its mother's arms. An elderly couple shared a bag of pretzels. Obama pulled out a book, something about climate policy, but didn't open it right away. He glanced at his daughter, who was staring out the window again, lost in thought. "You handled yourself well back there," he said softly. She turned to him. "I didn't do anything. You didn't have to," he said. "Sometimes just staying calm is the bravest thing you can do," she smiled faintly. "I learned from you." He chuckled, but there was warmth in it. "Don't give me too much credit. You've always had your own kind of strength." They fell into a comfortable silence after that. No need to fill the space with noise. Outside, the sky deepened into twilight, stars beginning to prick through the darkness. Hours earlier, before Obama arrived, Sasha had felt invisible in the worst way, seen only as a target, not as a person. Now, flying home with her father beside her, she felt seen in the best way, fully, quietly, without expectation. Meanwhile, at the final destination airport, Michelle Obama waited near the arrivals exit, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She'd gotten a text from her husband an hour ago. "Everything's fine. We're on our way." But she knew her daughter. She knew the toll these moments took even when they ended peacefully. She'd raised both her girls to be strong, but she also knew strength wasn't the same as invincibility. When the flight landed and passengers began to trickle out, she spotted them immediately, Sasha first, then Barack just behind, rolling both their bags. Sasha's shoulders were relaxed now. Her step was lighter. Michelle didn't rush forward. She just stood there, and when their eyes met, Sasha's face broke into a real smile, the kind that starts in the eyes. They hugged without saying a word. Then Michelle turned to her husband and gave him a look that said everything. "Thank you. I know what you did. I know why it mattered." As they walked toward the parking garage, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement from an earlier rain, no one spoke about the incident again. Not because it wasn't important, but because its meaning had already settled into their bones. It wasn't about fame or politics. It was about a father showing up for his child. About dignity in the face of pettiness. About how one moment of courage or quiet presence can change the temperature of an entire room. Later that night, after dinner and quiet conversation at home, Sasha would sit on the back porch with a mug of tea, listening to the crickets and the distant hum of traffic. She wouldn't replay the mockery in her head. Instead, she'd remember the way her father's voice had cut through the noise, not with anger but with clarity. And she'd feel once again that she wasn't alone. And somewhere in 1,000 different places, people who'd witnessed the scene or heard about it secondhand would carry a small lesson forward. That how we treat strangers matters more than we think. That assumptions can wound. And that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply show up and remind others what decency looks like. The story wouldn't make national news. It wouldn't be turned into a movie or a viral clip, but in the lives of those who were there it would linger, not as drama but as truth. And sometimes that's enough. The airport had long since returned to its usual rhythm. Rolling suitcases, boarding calls, the low hum of travelers passing through like water over stones. But for those who'd been near Gate B14 that afternoon, something had shifted. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't come with sirens or headlines. It was quieter than that. The kind of change that settles in your chest and stays there, like a lesson you didn't know you needed. By the time Sasha and her father landed at their final destination, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft purples and oranges. Michelle was waiting just past the security checkpoint, arms open before either of them could say a word. There were no questions, no probing for details, just a long hug that said everything. She held Sasha a little longer, her hand resting gently on the back of her daughter's head, as if to smooth away the invisible weight that had settled there hours earlier. They drove home in comfortable silence. The city lights flickered past the car windows, familiar and steady. Inside the house, dinner was already warming in the oven, something simple, comforting, the kind of meal that smells like home no matter where you've been. They ate at the kitchen table, not the dining room, because tonight wasn't about formality. It was about being together. Later, while washing dishes, Barack glanced at Sasha, who was drying a plate with slow, thoughtful movements. "You know," he said, "what happened today, it wasn't your fault." She nodded but didn't look up. "I know, but part of me still wonders, if I'd said something sooner, maybe it wouldn't have gone that far. You shouldn't have had to," he said gently. "No one should have to defend their right to exist quietly in public." She finally met his eyes. "But people do it all the time, every day, and most of them don't have someone like you walking in to back them up." He paused, sponge in hand. "That's true. And that's why moments like today matter. Not because I showed up, but because it reminded people that kindness isn't weakness. That standing up for someone doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it just means showing up and saying, 'This isn't right.'" She thought about that as she stacked the plates in the cabinet. It wasn't about heroics. It was about humanity. Meanwhile, back at the airport they'd left behind, the story was beginning to move, slowly, carefully, through the veins of everyday life. A baggage handler who'd been near gate B14 during the incident mentioned it to his wife over dinner. "You should have seen it," he said, shaking his head. "One minute these folks are laughing like they're on some reality show, the next, boom, President Obama's standing right there. And you know what?" He didn't yell, didn't threaten, just looked him in the eye and said, "That's my daughter." His wife, a nurse who'd seen her share of human cruelty and kindness, listened quietly. Later, she told a co-worker, and the story passed like a quiet ember from hand to hand. At a nearby high school, the college student who'd almost recorded the scene sat in her bedroom, typing a short reflection for her journalism class, not as an assignment, but because she couldn't stop thinking about it. She didn't name names. She didn't sensationalize. She just wrote about how power can be used gently, how accountability doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a badge. Her teacher read it the next day and kept it in her desk drawer, not for grading, but because it reminded her why she taught. And then there were the 5 people who'd done the mocking. They'd scattered after their flight landed, some to rental cars, others to ride shares, but none of them spoke to each other again. One man, a mid-level manager at a tech firm, sat in his hotel room that night staring at the ceiling. He kept replaying Obama's words, "You never know what someone's been through." He thought about his own daughter, away at college, and wondered if she'd ever been on the receiving end of careless comments like the ones he'd made. The thought made his stomach twist. He didn't post an apology online. He didn't call a reporter. But the next morning he called his daughter just to hear her voice and listened more than he usually did. Another member of the group, the woman who'd cried at the gate, wrote a note in her journal before bed. Not an excuse, not a defense. Just, "I was wrong, and I won't do that again." Sometimes, change starts with a single sentence in the dark. Back in the Obama home, Sasha sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a light sweater, watching fireflies blink in the backyard. Her phone buzzed once, a text from a close friend who'd heard a vague rumor about something happening at the airport. She typed back, "It's okay, really." She didn't go into details. Some things didn't need to be shared widely to matter. Inside, Barack and Michelle sat at the kitchen table with mugs of tea, talking in low voices. "She's stronger than we give her credit for," Michelle said. "She always has been," he replied. "But strength doesn't mean she shouldn't be protected," Michelle nodded. "I just hate that she still has to deal with that kind of thing." "After everything," "It's not about her last name," he said softly. "It's about who she is. And the world still doesn't know how to treat black women with quiet confidence, especially when they don't ask for attention." They sat in silence for a while after that. The kind of silence that only comes between two people who've weathered decades together. The next morning, a local news station received an anonymous tip about a notable encounter at the airport. A producer looked into it, found a few eyewitness accounts but no photos or videos. The station decided not to run a story. There was no conflict, no scandal, just a moment of human decency. And in today's news cycle, that rarely made the cut. But that didn't mean it didn't matter. At a coffee shop near the airport, a barista who'd been working during the incident told a regular customer about it while steaming milk. "It was weird," she said. "One second the whole gate felt tense, like everyone was holding their breath. The next it was like someone turned down the volume on the whole world, and then peace." The customer, a retired teacher, sipped her latte and smiled. "Sounds like leadership." "Yeah," the barista said. "The real kind." As the days passed, the story didn't blow up. No viral clips. No think pieces. But it lived in conversations, in memories, in small choices people made afterward. A man at a grocery store let a young woman go ahead of him in line without comment. A woman on the subway gave up her seat to someone who looked tired. Tiny acts, maybe. But they added up. Sasha returned to her routine, meetings, errands, late-night calls with friends. She didn't bring up the airport again, not even with her parents. But something had settled in her, something steadier. She walked with her head a little higher. Not out of pride, but because she knew, deep down, that she deserved space in the world just as she was. And then, a week later, something unexpected happened. A handwritten letter arrived at the family's office. No return address. Just a plain envelope with Sasha's name written in careful cursive. Inside was a short note from one of the women in the group, the one who'd cried at the gate. "I'm writing to say I'm truly sorry. What we said was unkind and unfair. We didn't know who you were, but that's no excuse. I've spent the last week thinking about how often I've judged people without knowing their story. Thank you for your silence. It taught me more than any lecture could have. I hope you can forgive us." Sasha read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in a drawer, not to keep as proof, but as a reminder that people can change. She didn't write back. She didn't need to. The apology wasn't for her benefit alone. It was the woman's own step toward becoming better, and that was enough. Later that evening, during a family walk around the neighborhood, Sasha mentioned the letter to her parents. Barack listened, then said, "That's the thing about moments like that. They don't just affect the person being hurt. They ripple out. Sometimes they wake people up." Michelle squeezed her daughter's hand. "And sometimes they remind us that we're not alone." The streetlights flickered on as dusk settled. Crickets sang in the grass. A neighbor waved from their porch. Everything felt ordinary again, but not the same. Because now, woven into the fabric of their lives, was a quiet truth. That dignity, when met with courage, can shift the air around it, and sometimes, all it takes is one person showing up, not as a president, not as a symbol, but as a father, to remind the world what really matters. Weeks passed, and the airport incident settled into memory. Not forgotten, but no longer raw. Life moved on, as it always does, carrying people forward in its quiet current. But the ripples from that afternoon kept spreading, in ways no one could have predicted. Sasha returned to her usual rhythm. Meetings with colleagues, late-night walks through her neighborhood, coffee runs where she chatted with the barista by name. She didn't talk about what happened at the airport, not because it was shameful, but because it felt too personal to turn into a story for others. Still, something had shifted inside her. She carried herself with a new kind of calm, not defensive, not performative, just steady. Like she'd been reminded that her presence alone was enough, no explanation required. Her parents noticed. They didn't say much, but there were small gestures. A longer hug before leaving the house, a shared look over dinner that said, "We see you. We're proud." They knew better than to treat her like she needed fixing. She'd handled it her own way, and that was what mattered. Meanwhile, far from the spotlight, the people who'd witnessed the scene at Gate B14 began to carry its lesson into their own corners of the world. One of them was a high school counselor who'd been waiting for a flight home after a conference. She'd watched the whole thing unfold from a nearby bench, heart pounding as the group mocked Sasha, then nearly holding her breath when Obama stepped in. She didn't record it. She didn't post about it. But the next week, during a session with a student who'd been bullied for dressing too fancy, she found herself saying, "You don't owe anyone an apology for taking up space." The words surprised her. They weren't from a textbook or a training module. They were from that moment in the terminal, from the quiet strength she'd seen in a young woman who refused to shrink. Another witness, a retired firefighter waiting to pick up his granddaughter, mentioned the incident during a community meeting about local safety. He wasn't talking about security or policing. He was talking about respect. "We spend so much time teaching people how to react to danger," he said, "but not enough time teaching them how to treat strangers like human beings." His words sparked a quiet conversation that led to a new workshop. At the local library, everyday kindness designed for teens and adults. Alike, even airport staff felt the shift. A gate agent who'd been working that day later told a new trainee, "Your job isn't just about flights and boarding passes. It's about watching the room. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is notice when someone's being treated unfairly and be ready to step in. Even if it's just with your eyes." It wasn't in the manual, but it became part of the unspoken code among the team. Back in the Obama household, life returned to its familiar pace: laundry, grocery runs, Sunday morning pancakes. But one evening, while flipping through channels, Michelle paused on a news segment about public behavior and civility. The reporter interviewed experts about rising rudeness in shared spaces: airports, stores, public transit. No mention of Sasha or the incident, but the theme was clear. People were forgetting how to treat each other. Barack looked up from his book. "Funny how something small can echo." "It wasn't small," Michelle said softly. "Not to her. Not to the people who saw it," he nodded. "Maybe that's the point. The big moments get headlines, but the quiet ones, they change people." A few days later, Sasha attended a small gathering at a friend's apartment, a mix of artists, organizers, and educators who often met to talk about community work. No one knew her full story, and she didn't share it. But when the conversation turned to public spaces and who feels safe in them, she spoke up. "I think we underestimate how exhausting it is to move through the world when you're constantly being judged," she said, stirring her tea. "It's not just about big acts of hate. It's the little things, the stares, the comments disguised as jokes, the assumption that you don't belong. That wears on you." The room grew quiet. One woman nodded slowly. "Yeah, and sometimes you just want to sit in an airport without having to prove you're worthy of being there." Sasha smiled faintly. "Exactly." Later, as she walked home under streetlights, she realized she hadn't felt the need to hide or explain herself during that conversation. She'd just spoken her truth and been heard. That in itself felt like healing. Meanwhile, the group that had made the comments continued to grapple with what happened, each in their own way. One man, the one who joked about the private jet, started volunteering at a youth center near his office. He didn't tell anyone why, but every Tuesday he showed up to help kids with homework, listen to their stories, and remind them, often without saying it outright, that they mattered, exactly as they were. He never mentioned the airport, but in his mind, it was his quiet way of making amends. The woman who'd written the apology letter began mentoring a young woman at her company, someone who'd recently joined and often stayed quiet in meetings. She made a point to ask for her opinion, to credit her ideas, to create space where she felt seen. It wasn't grand. It was just consistent. And over time, the younger woman began to speak up more, her confidence growing like a plant finally given light. These weren't dramatic transformations. No one became a saint overnight. But they'd been shaken gently, firmly by a moment that forced them to look in the mirror. And instead of turning away, some chose to stay and look closer. Back home, Sasha received another letter, this time from a stranger. A teacher in Ohio wrote that she'd heard about the airport story from a student's parent, who'd been there that day, and used it as a lesson in her classroom. Not to glorify fame, but to talk about empathy. "We discussed how easy it is to assume things about people we don't know," she wrote, "and how one act of courage like your father's can remind us all to do better." Sasha read it at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window. She folded it carefully and added it to the drawer with the first letter. She still didn't plan to speak publicly about it. but she was starting to understand that her silence didn't mean the story had no impact. Sometimes the most powerful lessons are passed hand to hand, heart to heart, without ever hitting a screen. One afternoon, while visiting her mother's office, Sasha overheard a conversation between Michelle and a colleague about leadership. "People think it's about speeches and stages," Michelle was saying. "But real leadership shows up in everyday moments, when you choose kindness over convenience, when you protect someone without needing credit." Sasha lingered in the doorway for a moment before knocking. She didn't say anything about what she'd heard, but later, as they walked to lunch, she slipped her arm through her mother's and said, "You know, I think I'm starting to figure out what matters." Michelle smiled. "What's that?" "Showing up," Sasha said simply. "For yourself. For others, even when it's hard." Her mother squeezed her arm. "That's the hardest and most important kind of showing up there is." As the weeks turned into months, the story never became a headline. No documentaries were made. No hashtags trended. But in living rooms, classrooms, airport terminals, and coffee shops, it lived on. Not as gossip, but as a quiet example of what decency looks like in action. And for Sasha, that was more than enough. She wasn't looking for fame or validation. She just wanted to live her life with integrity, to move through the world without having to armor herself against every glance. And slowly she was learning that she could. One evening, she sat on the back porch again, the same spot where she'd processed everything weeks before. The air was cooler now, autumn creeping in at the edges. Her phone buzzed, a message from a friend. "Saw someone being rude to a traveler at the train station today. I said something. Felt weird at first, but right." Sasha typed back, "Good. Keep doing that." She set the phone down and looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. She thought about all the people who'd been kind that day, who'd chosen to see others as human, who'd remembered that everyone carries invisible weight, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because she'd seen up close how one moment of courage could plant seeds in the most unexpected places. That was the real legacy of that day at the airport. Not the presence of a former president, but the reminder that every person has the power to shift the air around them. With a word, a look, a choice. And sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away. Time has a way of softening edges. What once felt sharp and immediate, the sting of unkind words, the tension in a crowded terminal, the quiet thunder of a father stepping in, gradually settles into something quieter, something wiser. Months after the incident at the airport, the story hadn't faded. It had simply changed shape, like a river carving its path through stone, leaving traces in places no one expected. Sasha no longer thought about it every day, but she carried it with her, not as a wound, but as a compass. It reminded her that dignity doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits in silence. Sometimes it walks into a room and changes everything without raising its voice. And sometimes it's just the simple act of refusing to let someone make you feel small. She'd returned to her life with a new kind of clarity. She still traveled alone when she wanted to, still wore her favorite hoodie, still sat near gates and waited for flights like anyone else, but now there was a quiet confidence in the way she held herself, not defiant, not performative, just sure. She knew her worth wasn't up for debate, and she didn't need to prove it to strangers. Her parents watched this shift with quiet pride. They didn't bring it up often. They didn't need to. They saw it in the way she laughed more freely, in how she spoke her mind without apology, in the ease with which she moved through spaces that once felt uncertain. She wasn't the same person who'd sat at gate B14 that day, and that was okay. Growth rarely announces itself with fanfare. It just shows up, one quiet choice at a time. Meanwhile, the ripples from that afternoon kept spreading far beyond the airport walls. In a high school classroom 3 states away, a teacher used the story, not by name but as a parable, during a lesson on empathy. "Imagine you're in a public place," she told her students. "You see someone being mocked for no reason. What do you do?" The discussion that followed wasn't about heroes or villains. It was about responsibility. One student said, "I'd say something even if my voice shook." Another admitted, "I'd probably stay quiet, but I'd want to be the kind of person who speaks up." That honesty sparked a deeper conversation, one that stayed with them long after the bell rang. At a community center in a mid-sized city, a workshop titled Everyday Respect began drawing steady attendance. It wasn't flashy. No celebrities, no media. Just neighbors gathering to talk about how to treat each other in shared spaces. Grocery stores, buses, parks, airports. The facilitator, a retired social worker who'd heard about the incident from a friend, opened each session with a simple question. When was the last time you gave someone the benefit of the doubt? The answers varied, but the theme was the same. Kindness is a practice, not a moment. Even in corporate offices, the story found its way in. A manager who'd been part of a diversity training session shared a version of it, again without names, as an example of unconscious bias. We assume things about people based on how they look, how they dress, how they carry themselves, he told his team. But those assumptions can hurt, and sometimes the person you're judging is someone's child. The room fell silent. Later, one employee emailed him to say it was the first time she'd felt seen in a company meeting. Back home, Sasha began volunteering with a youth mentorship program, not because of the airport incident, but because it felt like the next right thing. She didn't talk about her past. She just listened, really listened to the young people she worked with. When a teenager confessed she was scared to speak up in class because she didn't sound smart enough, Sasha said, "Your voice matters not because of how it sounds, but because it's yours." The girl looked at her, surprised, then nodded slowly, as if something had clicked into place. That was the thing about the story. It wasn't really about fame or power. It was about humanity, and humanity thrives in the small. Unrecorded moments, a nod of solidarity, a quiet apology, a decision to speak up when it would be easier to stay silent. One evening, months later, Barack Obama gave a speech at a university commencement. He didn't mention the airport. He didn't need to. But midway through his talk, he paused and said something that made the audience lean in. "Leadership isn't always about standing on a stage," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Sometimes it's about standing up for someone in a crowded room. Sometimes it's about showing up when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. Because decency isn't a performance, it's a choice, and it's a choice we get to make every single day." In the audience, a young woman who'd been at Gate B14 that day felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't told anyone she was there. But in that moment she knew he was speaking to her, and to everyone who'd ever chosen kindness over convenience. After the speech, a reporter asked if he was referring to a specific event. He smiled slightly and said, "I'm referring to all of them, the ones we see and the ones we don't." That answer became a footnote in the news cycle, but for those who understood, it was everything. Sasha watched the speech from home, curled up on the couch with a blanket. She didn't cry. She just felt a deep sense of peace. Her father hadn't made it about her. He'd made it about all of us. And that was the point. As the year turned, the story continued to live, not in headlines but in habits. A man held the door for a stranger without expecting thanks. A woman apologized when she realized she'd interrupted someone in a meeting. A teenager stood up for a classmate being teased in the hallway. None of these acts were grand. None made the news. But together they formed a quiet revolution. One built on the simple belief that everyone deserves to be treated like they belong. And that, more than anything, was the legacy of that day at the airport. Sasha never gave interviews about it. She never posted about it online. She didn't need to. Her life became her answer. She showed up, in her work, in her community, in her relationships, with the same quiet strength she'd shown that day in the terminal. And in doing so, she reminded others that you don't need a title to demand respect. You just need to know your own worth. Years later, a young girl would read about the Obamas in a school book and ask her mother, was Sasha really treated badly just for being herself? Her mother would pause, then say, yes. But what matters more is how she handled it, and how her father reminded everyone that kindness is never weakness. The story would become part of the quiet fabric of how people talked about respect, about public behavior, about what it means to raise children in a world that doesn't always see them clearly, not as a scandal but as a lesson. And in the end, that was enough, because real change rarely comes with sirens or spotlights. It comes in the stillness after the noise, in the choices people make when no one's watching, in the way a single moment of courage can echo through lives for years to come. Sasha knew that now. And as she walked through the world, head high, heart open, unafraid to take up space, she carried that truth with her, not as a burden, but as a gift. The airport was just a place. The mocking voices were just noise. But the lesson? That lasted, and so did she.